A visit to First United. The heavy glass door of First United swung inward as Mr. Thomas, smile already in place, entered. The air within, artificially chilled against the August swelter, possessed that familiar, almost clinical coolness. The usual tapestry of subdued sounds, hushed conversations, the clicking cadence of keyboards, the pneumatic whisper of internal mail, usually formed a comforting ambience. Today, though, the sounds felt dampened, almost strained. He cast an observant gaze over the small lobby. Near the brochure stand, two senior women meticulously completed deposit slips, their bifocals perched precariously on their noses. A young man in a rumpled suit squirmed in a molded plastic chair, clutching a manila envelope like a talisman. Three tellers were occupied behind the counter. Mr. Thomas chose the shortest queue, behind a woman, carefully counting out a handful of well-worn bills. When his turn arrived, he approached the counter. The teller, a young woman with tightly coiled brown hair and a name tag identifying her as Ms. Davis, offered only a cursory glance. Her fingers danced nervously over the keyboard. "Good morning," Mr. Thomas offered, his voice a warm, even cadence. Ms. Davis started, her eyes widening momentarily before flickering away. "Morning," she mumbled, barely above a whisper. She avoided his gaze, fixedly studying the monitor. Mr. Thomas slid a check across the smooth surface, a substantial quarterly dividend from his investments. He typically made these deposits electronically, but the morning had beckoned him outside, and he'd craved a change, a bit of personal interaction. Ms. Davis picked up the check, her motions abrupt, almost involuntary. She scrutinized it with what felt like exaggerated care, holding it to the light as though searching for a hidden watermark. A faint furrow etched itself between her eyebrows. "Anything else I can help you with today?" he inquired, keeping his tone pleasant, hoping to ease the disquiet that was beginning to prickle at him. "Just need to verify some information," she replied, her voice devoid of inflection. She began to type rapidly, her fingers striking the keys with a sharp, staccato rhythm. The keyboard's sound amplified in the sudden hush. Mr. Thomas waited patiently, his hands clasped loosely before him. He noticed Ms. Davis stealing glances, a furtive, almost suspicious scrutiny. What would be taking so long? He'd been a customer of First United for years, his accounts impeccable, never a hiccup. Finally, after what seemed an age, Ms. Davis ceased typing and cleared her throat. "I need to see some identification, please." Mr. Thomas's brow lifted slightly. Unusual. He had deposited similar amounts countless times without being asked for proof of identity. Nevertheless, he retrieved his driver's license from his wallet and placed it on the counter. Ms. Davis picked it up, comparing the photograph to his face with meticulous attention. Her gaze lingered a beat too long, a fleeting, indecipherable spark in her eyes. Something he couldn't quite decipher. Unease? Distrust, perhaps? She input something else into the computer, then returned the license without a word. "Okay," she said, her tone still devoid of genuine warmth. "Just one moment." She swiveled slightly in her chair and spoke in hushed tones to the teller beside her, a young man with meticulously styled hair. Mr. Thomas couldn't discern the words, but he saw Ms. Davis gesture in his direction. The young man glanced over, a brief flicker of curiosity crossing his features. That brief interchange, though ostensibly innocent, amplified Mr. Thomas's burgeoning unease. He possessed a finely tuned sense for nuances, for the unspoken currents that ran beneath polite exchange. And presently, that undercurrent fell off. Ms. Davis turned back to him, her face now a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. "Everything appears to be in order," she stated, her voice strained. "I'm depositing the check now." She processed the transaction quickly, efficiently, but without any hint of apology or explanation. She printed a receipt and handed it to him, her fingers barely making contact. "Thank you," Mr. Thomas said, his tone even but laced with an almost imperceptible edge of steel. Ms. Davis offered no response, simply turning her attention to the next customer, a frazzled-looking mother burdened with a toddler and a diaper bag. Mr. Thomas took the receipt and turned to leave. As he neared the exit, he paused, glancing back at Ms. Davis. She was pointedly avoiding his gaze, her head bowed low over the counter. He pushed open the glass door and stepped back into the sunshine. The heat now felt oppressive, the air heavy and stagnant. He inhaled deeply, attempting to dispel the disquiet that clung to him like static electricity. The deposit had proceeded without a hitch, yet the entire transaction left a metallic taste in his mouth. It wasn't merely the lack of amiability or the unusual request for identification. It was something else, something elusive, just beyond his grasp. A sense of being assessed, viewed not as Mr. Thomas, a long-standing patron of First United, but as something other, something different. He walked to his car, his mind already churning. He couldn't shake the conviction that this seemingly minor incident was a symptom of something larger, something profoundly unsettling. He resolved to scrutinize his account statements to ensure everything was in order, and he determined to speak with the branch manager to seek answers. This wasn't the First United he recognized. Something had changed, and he intended to discover its nature. The charity request. The following Tuesday, Mr. Thomas approached First United Bank with a slightly lighter step, though the unease from the previous week still lingered like a faint scent. He needed to withdraw funds for the annual Hope for the Homeless charity golf tournament, a cause he championed wholeheartedly. The event was this weekend, and he'd promised to deliver the check by Friday. He hoped for a different teller, anyone but Ms. Davis. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. She sat behind the same window, her posture just as stiff, her eyes darting nervously around the bank. "Good morning, Ms. Davis," he said, forcing a smile. "I need to make a withdrawal." "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," she replied, her voice a touch too high-pitched. She didn't meet his eyes. He slid his withdrawal slip across the counter, requesting $5,000. The sum represented a significant portion of his usual donation, but he'd had a particularly good quarter and wanted to make a real impact. Ms. Davis took the slip, her fingers trembling slightly. She tapped away at her keyboard with undue force, the clicking echoing in the otherwise quiet bank. Her brow furrowed, and she re-entered something, her lips moving silently. Finally, she looked up, her face pale. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm showing insufficient funds." Mr. Thomas stared at her, incredulous. "Insufficient funds? That's impossible. I reviewed my balance online this morning. There should be more than enough." He kept his tone even, polite, despite the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. Ms. Davis blinked rapidly. "Let me check again," she mumbled, and once more attacked the keyboard. The clicking was louder now, almost frantic. He watched her, his unease growing. Something was definitely wrong. After another agonizing minute, she looked up again, her eyes wide with what seemed like genuine fear. "No, sir. It's still showing insufficient funds. The available balance is significantly lower than your requested amount." Mr. Thomas felt a surge of disbelief. He knew his account balance. He managed his finances meticulously. He always kept a substantial cushion, especially given the vagaries of the market. "Ms. Davis," he said, his voice now edged with a hint of steel, "with all due respect, I believe there must be a mistake. Could you please call a supervisor?" He kept his tone level, projecting calm even as his internal alarm bells blared. He didn't want to cause a scene, but he wouldn't be dismissed. She hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the back office. I can try," she stammered, "but they're very busy. Please, Ms. Davis. It's rather urgent. This is for a charity event this weekend, and I need to deliver the funds by Friday." He emphasized the word charity, hoping it might penetrate whatever fog clouded her judgment. She fidgeted with the pen on the counter, avoiding his gaze. He noticed a bead of sweat trickling down her temple. Something was seriously amiss. Was she being coerced? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was she simply incompetent? Finally, she relented. "Okay, Mr. Thomas. One moment." She swiveled her chair and mumbled something into the phone. He couldn't make out the words, but he heard the distinct sound of forced cheerfulness in her voice. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the counter, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being deliberately obstructed. The previous week's suspicious scrutiny, coupled with this blatant error, painted a disturbing picture. He glanced around the bank. A few other customers stood in line, their faces reflecting varying degrees of boredom and impatience. The atmosphere felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. He wondered if anyone else had experienced similar issues. Ms. Davis hung up the phone, her expression unreadable. "The supervisor will be with you shortly, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice flat. "Please wait here." He nodded curtly, his eyes fixed on her. He would wait, but he wouldn't be placated. He was determined to get to the bottom of this, even if it meant uncovering something unpleasant. He deserved an explanation, and so did the charity he was trying to support. The Hope for the Homeless event relied on donations like his, and he wouldn't let some bank error, or something far worse, derail their efforts. He stood his ground, a silent sentinel in the sterile, brightly lit bank, ready to fight for what was right. System error. Mr. Thomas retrieved his phone, the chilled surface a momentary balm against his flushed cheeks. He tapped the banking icon, the app's cerulean hue a jarring contrast to the alarm bells clanging in his head. "Perhaps this will clarify matters," he stated, striving for composure. He tilted the screen towards Ms. Davis, showcasing the freshly generated statement. "As you can see, the account comfortably exceeds the withdrawal amount. Substantially so, in fact." Ms. Davis's gaze flickered across the displayed figures, her breath growing shallow and ragged. A lone droplet of sweat traced a path down her temple, glittering under the bank's stark fluorescent lights. Instead of conceding error, she stubbornly defended her position. "Sir, I see the balance, but the system, it's registering insufficient funds. It must be a glitch." "A glitch?" Mr. Thomas echoed, his brows arching skeptically. He touched the screen, enlarging the balance readout. "This is a live statement, Ms. Davis, generated within the hour. It reflects all transactions. Are you questioning the system's integrity?" Her fingers performed a nervous tattoo on the keyboard. It happens occasionally, sir. Temporary anomalies. It should correct itself shortly." Her voice trembled, revealing her unease. Impatience prickled at Mr. Thomas. "Shortly? The charity golf tournament is tomorrow. This money is dedicated to youth programs. Shortly doesn't suffice." He lowered his tone, striving to remain even-keeled. "Surely there's a method to override the block, or at least examine the discrepancy." Ms. Davis shook her head, her eyes darting to the growing queue of customers behind Mr. Thomas. He felt their collective irritation pressing against him, a wave of impatience. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice strained. "I lack the authorization to bypass the system. And as I mentioned, the supervisor is unavailable." "Unavailable?" Mr. Thomas repeated, incredulous. "For how long? What exactly is the nature of this issue? Is it a widespread problem? Are other clients affected?" She evaded his stare, toying with the pen on the counter. I don't possess that information, sir. All I can confirm is that the system indicates insufficient funds." Frustration tightened his features. This had transcended mere money. It was now about principle, about dignified treatment, addressed concerns, rudimentary service. A long-standing patron, he deserved more than this dismissive attitude. "So, let me understand this," he said, a sharp edge entering his voice. "I present a valid statement confirming available funds, and you maintain, without explanation, that I cannot access my money due to a nebulous glitch? Is that accurate?" Ms. Davis's silence offered tacit confirmation. Mr. Thomas inhaled deeply, fighting to regain command. He glanced at the line of people behind him, their expressions hardening with annoyance. He was causing a delay, a spectacle. The woman with the stroller glared openly. A businessman checked his watch with theatrical exasperation. A wave of shame washed over him. He was being portrayed as unable to afford the withdrawal of a few $1,000s before strangers. A subtle but cutting form of public humiliation. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "If you're unable to complete the withdrawal, I will move my account elsewhere." He began to turn away, then looked back at Ms. Davis. "I anticipate a complete explanation for this glitch and its immediate resolution, and I will be speaking with the branch manager at the earliest opportunity." He left the counter, the weight of unanswered questions heavy on his shoulders. The gazes of the waiting customers followed him, their judgment palpable. He felt a burning mix of indignation and mortification as he pushed through the bank's heavy doors and re-entered the sunlight. The cool autumn air offered little relief from his simmering anger. This was far from resolved. Defense from an unexpected place. The air in the bank thickened with Mr. Thomas's simmering anger, a palpable tension that even the polished chrome of the teller station seemed to absorb. He'd asked for a simple withdrawal, presented the irrefutable proof, and yet Ms. Davis, with her tight, almost panicked smile, continued to insist on the impossibility of it all. He felt the judging eyes of the queue boring into his back, each shuffle and sigh amplifying his humiliation. He was about to demand to speak to a manager again, ready to unleash the full force of his frustration, when a voice cut through the oppressive atmosphere. "Excuse me," the voice said, clear and unwavering, a melodic counterpoint to the harsh sounds of the city filtering in from the street. Mr. Thomas turned to see a woman standing a few feet behind him in queue. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with a cascade of silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, held a sharp intelligence that immediately commanded attention. She wore a tailored navy suit, the kind that spoke of quiet confidence and understated elegance. He didn't recognize her. Ms. Davis, momentarily distracted from her keyboard, gave the woman a curt, professional smile. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "Yes, you can," the woman replied, her gaze fixed on Mr. Thomas. "I believe you're speaking with Mr. Thomas, aren't you?" Ms. Davis hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between Mr. Thomas and the woman. "Yes, ma'am, but there seems to be a slight system issue." The woman raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "A system issue preventing Mr. Thomas from accessing his own funds? That's unusual." She stepped forward, her presence radiating a calm authority that seemed to momentarily deflate the tension in the room. "I know Mr. Thomas. My name is Eleanor Gable, and I've had the pleasure of knowing him for several years through his philanthropic work with the city's youth programs. He's a pillar of this community, a man of impeccable character and integrity." Mr. Thomas felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, a surprising balm to his burning frustration. He hadn't expected this staunch and public defense from a stranger. He offered Mrs. Gable a small, appreciative nod. Mrs. Gable continued, her voice gaining strength. "To see him standing here, being given the runaround over what I assume is a perfectly legitimate transaction, is frankly appalling. Are you suggesting, Ms. Davis, that Mr. Thomas is somehow not entitled to his own money?" Ms. Davis's composure finally cracked. Her smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something akin to fear. She stammered, "No, ma'am, of course not. It's just the system. It's showing an error." She gestured vaguely at her computer screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if searching for an escape route. "An error that only seems to affect Mr. Thomas?" Mrs. Gable pressed, her voice laced with skepticism. "I find that rather hard to believe. Perhaps you should call your supervisor, Ms. Davis. I'm sure they can rectify this system error with a minimum of fuss." The other customers, who had been silently observing the scene, began to murmur in agreement. A few shifted their weight, their impatience now directed at Ms. Davis rather than Mr. Thomas. The atmosphere had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. Ms. Davis's face flushed crimson. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her gaze fixed on the glowing screen. I already tried calling my supervisor," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "They are unavailable." Mrs. Gable's expression hardened. "Unavailable? In the middle of a business day? I'm starting to suspect this system error is less about technology and more about something else entirely." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, a clear accusation. Perhaps we should call the police and have them investigate this unusual banking practice. I'm sure they'd be very interested to learn about it. Mr. Thomas watched the scene unfold, a mixture of relief and disbelief swirling within him. He had been prepared for a battle, for escalating the situation to a point of public confrontation. But Mrs. Gable had stepped in, wielding her words like a shield, defending his reputation and challenging the blatant injustice of the situation. He was no longer alone in this fight. The manager's misjudgment. The murmur in the bank had risen. Other customers, initially politely ignoring the drama unfolding at window 3, now openly stared. Ms. Davis, beads of sweat slicking her forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning, stammered, but the system flagged it. Protocol. Eleanor Gable's voice, though still calm, now possessed an edge sharper than a newly minted coin. Protocol does not override common sense, Ms. Davis, nor does it supersede the reputation of a man who has consistently and generously supported this community. Are you suggesting Mr. Thomas is attempting to defraud his own bank? Before Ms. Davis could further incriminate herself, a new voice boomed across the lobby. What in tarnation is going on here? Mr. Johnson, the branch manager, a portly man whose tie always seemed a size too small for his collar, strode towards the teller window with an air of ruffled authority. He pushed his way through the gathering onlookers, his face a mask of barely suppressed irritation. Davis, I heard shouting. What's the problem? Ms. Davis, visibly relieved by the arrival of backup, launched into a rapid-fire explanation, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. Mr. Johnson, this gentleman, Mr. Thomas, attempted to withdraw a large sum. The system flagged the transaction as potentially fraudulent. I was simply following procedure. She gestured wildly at Mr. Thomas, her finger trembling. Mr. Johnson, without so much as a glance in Mr. Thomas's direction, patted Ms. Davis on the shoulder. There, Davis. You did the right thing. We can't be too careful these days. He then turned his attention to Mr. Thomas, his smile tight and condescending. Now, sir, he began, his voice dripping with patronizing affability, I understand there seems to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps you've forgotten the agreed-upon withdrawal limits for your account? It happens all the time, especially with our more senior clientele. Mr. Thomas's face, already etched with frustration, darkened. The subtle dig at his age, layered beneath the veneer of concern, was not lost on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor Gable cut him off. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice carrying a new, steely timbre that silenced the room. I can assure you, there is no misunderstanding. Mr. Thomas is perfectly aware of his account limits. I personally have witnessed him making far larger withdrawals on numerous occasions for his philanthropic endeavors. The issue here, Mr. Johnson, is not Mr. Thomas's memory, but rather Ms. Davis's inexplicable and, frankly, offensive behavior. Mr. Johnson, clearly taken aback by Eleanor's assertive tone, sputtered, Now, see here, madam. I won't have you speaking to my staff like that. Ms. Davis was merely being diligent. He still hadn't bothered to actually look at Mr. Thomas. Diligence is one thing, Mr. Johnson, Eleanor countered, her eyes fixed on his. Discrimination is another. And I assure you, the line between the two is becoming increasingly blurred in this situation. She subtly shifted her weight, her posture suggesting she was prepared to stand her ground for as long as necessary. Mr. Thomas, who had been quietly seething, finally found his voice. Mr. Johnson, he said, his tone low but firm, I have been a loyal customer of this bank for over 20 years. I have never encountered such blatant disrespect. I simply wish to access my own funds. Mr. Johnson finally turned his gaze to Mr. Thomas, his eyes narrowing slightly. He seemed to recognize him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the ingrained habit of siding with his employee, coupled with a dash of ingrained prejudice, quickly hardened his expression. Well, sir, he said, his voice losing some of its earlier condescension but retaining a dismissive edge, I'm sure there's a simple explanation. Perhaps there was an issue with the system, or maybe perhaps you're mistaken about the amount you have available." He chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. "It happens to the best of us." Mr. Thomas stared at Mr. Johnson, the manager's misjudgment palpable in the air. The implication was clear. He, a successful businessman and respected member of the community, was being treated like a doddering old fool. The humiliation stung far more than the initial denial of funds. He knew then, with a cold certainty, that this was more than just a simple error. Something was deeply wrong, taking matters into his own hands. The silence pressed down like a physical weight, broken only by the fluorescent light's monotonous drone. Mr. Thomas stood rigid, a pulse hammering a frantic tattoo against his temples. Humiliation, a venomous serpent, tightened its coils in his stomach, leaving a metallic tang on his tongue, the aftertaste of forced submission. He felt the collective gaze of the other patrons, a silent tribunal witnessing his mortification. Ms. Davis, perched on her teller's throne, seemed to diminish under his glare, her earlier brashness replaced with nervous tics. She fussed with the pens, a flurry of restless motion betraying her disquiet. Mr. Johnson's arrival, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a final judgment. Her relief was almost tangible, a subtle easing of her shoulders that didn't escape Mr. Thomas's notice. He drew a breath, the air snagging in his windpipe. "This," he said, his voice a controlled murmur, "is beyond the pale." No shouts, no theatrics, just a quiet authority that cut through the air. He fixed Ms. Davis with an unwavering stare, his face an impassive mask. "For over 2 decades, I've been a patron of this establishment. 20 years. I have entrusted my savings, my transactions, my financial future to this bank. And today I am treated as if I were some petty thief." He pivoted towards Mr. Johnson, who was now attempting to regain control, smoothing his tie in a gesture of practiced composure. "You, sir, have betrayed the very tenets of courtesy and consideration that this institution claims to uphold." He paused, letting his words resonate. The lights buzzed louder in the ensuing hush. A flush crept up his neck, the sting of injustice prickling at the corners of his eyes. He fought to remain composed, to not surrender to the rage bubbling beneath the surface. This wasn't about releasing pent-up frustration. It was about upholding fundamental rights. "I came here today with a straightforward request," he continued, his tone gaining momentum. "A request that any reputable financial institution would have granted without hesitation. Instead, I have been subjected to suspicion, inquisition, and blatant disrespect." He glanced briefly at Eleanor Gable, offering her a nearly imperceptible nod of gratitude. Her presence, her steadfast faith in him, had been a lifeline in this increasingly bizarre ordeal. Then he straightened his spine, his shoulders squaring with newfound resolve. The quiet dignity he projected was a sharp contrast to the surrounding turmoil. "I will resolve this matter," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. Immediately, he reached into his jacket, extracted his checkbook, and with agonizing slowness, ripped out a blank form. He placed it on a counter, pushing it toward Ms. Davis. "Consider this my formal instruction to close every account I hold here," he stated. Without exception, he watched as Ms. Davis's eyes widened in disbelief. He saw the shadow of apprehension flit across Mr. Johnson's features. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and walked towards the exit. Each footfall was measured, each movement deliberate. He ignored the inquisitive glances, the hushed whispers that followed his departure. His decision was made, his intentions declared. Now it was time to execute. The heavy glass doors parted, allowing a rush of cool air and city sounds to engulf him. He inhaled deeply, the gritty smell of exhaust and urban life a welcome contrast to the stale, suffocating air he had escaped. He didn't spare a backward glance. A plan was already taking shape in his mind. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, and dialed a number. As he walked away from the bank, a steely resolve hardened his features. This was far from over. He had been wronged, and he intended to seek redress. 7 minutes. Just 7 minutes. A mere handful of moments carried him from the foyer of First National, a fortress of financial probity where he'd worn a mask of controlled fury, to the sanctuary of his executive suite, where mahogany polish and the ghost of inherited wealth did little to quell the tempest within. He had traveled in that brief span from scorned customer to chief executive, a title that, for all its weight, couldn't erase the morning's sting. Self-pity held no appeal, wasted breath even less. Instead, he harnessed his anger, recognizing it as a high-octane fuel. His leather throne groaned beneath him as he swung toward the bank surveillance feed, dominating his screen. A favor called in, a debt leveraged he usually reserved for ventures with exponentially larger returns. Yet this felt far more significant. It was deeply, acutely personal. The playback showed a clear image of the teller, Johnson, his expression etched with smug superiority as he dealt with Mr. Thomas. There it was, captured for posterity. The dismissive flick of the wrist, a smirk that felt like a slap, the inventorying glance that swept over Mr. Thomas's bespoke suit, judging its worthiness. A complete and damning portrait of the prejudice he'd spent a lifetime combating. He magnified the image, fixing on Johnson's name tag. The lettering burned into his consciousness. He leaned back, the chair's protest a drawn-out sigh, his mind already architecting a suitable response. Legal recourse? Public excoriation? Both enticing, certainly, yet too cumbersome. He craved something cleaner, leaner, more impactful. His fingers danced across the keyboard, each tap a deliberate strike against the injustice he felt. He bypassed the tortuous labyrinth of HR protocol, the bureaucratic mire that would only weaken his intent. This wasn't about policy infractions, but about something far more fundamental. Respect, dignity, the swift, decisive consequences for unparalleled insolence. The termination letter bloomed on the monitor, stark and brutally efficient. He scrutinized the text, paring away any hint of emotion, leaving only the stark bones of the matter. Effective immediately, he typed, the words resonating in the hushed office. Your services are no longer required. He added a terse, impersonal explanation, due to conduct unbecoming a representative of this company. He debated elaborating, detailing the specific instance, but thought better of it. Restraint was a weapon. Let Johnson writhe in the dark, left to dissect his misdeeds and grasp at what he had lost. Uncertainty would be its own cruel teacher. He saved the file, his jaw muscles tight as piano wire, and pivoted toward the intercom. Sarah, a word, please. The response was immediate, crisp. Of course, Mr. Thomas. Sarah, his peerless executive assistant, materialized in the doorway, her face a study in composed capability. She possessed an uncanny ability to read his moods, preempt his requests before they left his lips. Today, however, she seemed to register the pressure building beneath his outward calm. Sarah, he began, his tone betraying nothing of the turmoil within. I need you to hand-deliver this. Personally. He printed the letter and extended it to her, careful to avoid her gaze. Sarah accepted the document, her brow arching almost imperceptibly as she noted the addressee. Mr. Johnson, First National Bank. She asked no questions, voiced no concerns. Only a silent nod. Of course, Mr. Thomas. Straight away, immediately, he confirmed, eyes locked on the distant cityscape framed by his window. And Sarah, discretion is paramount. I prefer this remains private. Understood, Mr. Thomas. She turned to depart, then paused at the threshold. Is everything quite all right, sir? A flicker of vulnerability. He battled the sudden urge to confide, to unburden himself. But he pressed it down. This was his to shoulder, his to resolve. Everything is as it should be, Sarah. Thank you. She nodded once more, concern lingering in her expression, then vanished, leaving him alone once more with the silence of the office. The quiet hung heavy, broken only by the low thrum of the city. He closed his eyes, picturing Johnson's visage as he absorbed the letter's contents, imagining the shock, the bewilderment, the gradual dawn of understanding that his arrogance had just cost him his livelihood. He opened his eyes, the rage still flickering, but dulled by a measure of bitter satisfaction. A skirmish won, a mere pinprick in the hide of a larger beast, but a beginning nonetheless. He would no longer be dismissed. He would not tolerate disrespect, and he would not let it go. The 7 minutes had elapsed, yet the repercussions were only just awakening. Consequences and apologies. Sarah, usually a picture of composed efficiency, felt a tremor in her hands as she clutched the sealed envelope. It felt heavier than its meager contents warranted. The fluorescent hum of the bank seemed amplified today, each buzz a tiny insect gnawing at her conscience. She found Johnson at his station, meticulously counting his stack of 20s. He looked up, a weary smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Something I can help you with, Sarah?" She swallowed, the words catching her throat. "Mr. Johnson, I have something for you from Mr. Thomas." She extended the envelope, her gaze fixed on the polished countertop. Johnson's smile faltered. He took the envelope, his fingers brushing hers. "Thomas? What's this about?" He tore it open with a sudden, jerky movement. The crisp snap of the paper was the only sound in the immediate vicinity. Sarah watched him read, his face slowly draining of color. The weariness in his eyes deepened into something she couldn't quite decipher. Disbelief, perhaps, mixed with a dawning, chilling understanding. He didn't say a word, just stared at the letter, his grip tightening until his knuckles shone white. She mumbled a strained, "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," and turned to leave, the weight in her chest heavier than ever. The news spread through the bank like a virulent strain of the flu. Whispers turned to hushed conversations, then to outright gasps of disbelief. Eyes darted towards Sarah as she made her way back to her desk. The air crackled with unspoken questions and simmering anxieties. Eleanor Gable watched her pass, her expression unreadable. Ms. Davis, who had been huddled with a group of tellers near the coffee machine, straightened up abruptly. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses. She pushed her way through the throng, her gaze fixed on finding Mr. Thomas. He was in the midst of a conference call, his voice a calm, authoritative counterpoint to the chaos swirling around him. Ms. Davis hovered outside his office, her anxiety palpable. She chewed on her lip, a nervous habit she hadn't indulged in for years. Finally, with a deep, fortifying breath, she knocked lightly on the door. Mr. Thomas paused mid-sentence. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said into the phone, his voice still even. "I have someone at the door. I'll be right back with you." He pressed the mute button and turned to face Ms. Davis. "Yes, Ms. Davis." His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. She wrung her hands. "Mr. Thomas, I need to apologize." The words rushed out in a breathless torrent. "I was wrong. Terribly wrong. I should have recognized you immediately. There's no excuse for my behavior. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, for the disrespect, for everything." Her voice cracked, and a tear escaped, tracing a lonely path down her cheek. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the depth of her distress. Mr. Thomas regarded her with an inscrutable expression. The fire in his eyes, so evident the previous day, was banked, leaving only a cold, assessing gaze. He leaned back his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "An apology is noted, Ms. Davis," he said finally, his voice devoid of warmth. "However, some actions have consequences. You may return to your duties." Ms. Davis stood there for a moment, uncertain, as though expecting him to say more. But he simply nodded curtly and turned back to his phone, unmuting the line. The polite, authoritative voice resumed its discussion of quarterly projections, leaving Ms. Davis standing alone in the doorway, the weight of her mistake crushing her. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She retreated silently, the buzz of the bank now sounding like a mournful dirge. A lesson learned. Ms. Davis's voice, a threadbare rasp, filtered through the speakerphone. Mr. Thomas, holding the device just so, could taste the acid tang of her desperation. His office, typically an oasis of focused industry, now pulsed with the day's fallout. Across from him, Sarah remained an enigma, her pen hovering above her notepad. Mr. Thomas, Ms. Davis began, her voice hitching. We are profoundly sorry for yesterday's treatment. The disrespect was indefensible. Utterly. He remained unmoved, a statue of granite etched with disapproval. He pictured her, shoulders slumped in her office, the bank's cold lights reflecting off her furrowed brow. Her words tumbled out. We realize apologies fall short, but I assure you, we're moving swiftly to correct the systemic flaws that enabled this. This reprehensible incident, reprehensible, hung in the air, a meager concession. The bank's lawyers, he knew, had likely neutered the statement, careful to avoid any real culpability. It didn't matter. He needed to hear the words, to savor the manufactured humility. Finally, he broke his silence. His tone was a low simmer of restrained fury. Apology noted, Ms. Davis. A collective exhalation seemed to whisper from the speakerphone. However, he pressed the single word a closing gate. Acknowledgement is not absolution. Yesterday wasn't a simple error. It was a flagrant display of prejudice and sheer incompetence. It exposed a disturbing contempt for those who trust you with their financial well-being. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Sarah's pen danced across the page, a tiny, agitated seismograph. This institution, he continued, each word deliberately chosen, needs a lesson in respect, in fairness, in genuine customer service. And that lesson, he stressed, will be learned through action, not empty pronouncements. An agonizing silence stretched taut. Then Ms. Davis, her voice with a newfound firmness, understood, Mr. Thomas. How can we begin to make amends? He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning softly. I'll be at the bank in 1 hour. I'll be withdrawing a considerable sum. I expect the transaction to be seamless, efficient, and performed with the utmost courtesy. Is that clear? Perfectly, Ms. Davis affirmed. He ended the call, the click echoing in the sudden vacuum. He turned to Sarah. Ready? She nodded, her expression a blend of anticipation and something bordering on reverence. An hour later, Mr. Thomas crossed the threshold of the bank. The atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. The usual buzz of commerce had evaporated, replaced by a hushed, almost worshipful stillness. Every pair of eyes tracked his movements. He walked directly towards Eleanor Gable's desk. She stood, her face pale but firm. Mr. Thomas, she greeted him, her voice steady. It's good to see you. Ms. Gable, he responded, a flicker of something akin to appreciation in his gaze. Thank you for your assistance yesterday. He then approached the teller window, where a young woman, her hands betraying her unease, awaited him. The transaction proceeded with remarkable speed and precision. The cash, meticulously stacked and secured with bands, was placed in the leather briefcase he had brought. The click of the closing latches echoed in the constrained silence. He surveyed the room, meeting the eyes of everyone present, from the tellers to the security guard, to Ms. Davis herself, who stood near the entrance of her office, her face a mask of apprehension. He offered a brief nod, a gesture devoid of both forgiveness and satisfaction, merely acknowledgement. Then, with a resolute posture, he exited the bank. The doors whispered shut behind him, leaving a void punctuated by the lingering weight of his presence and the sharp bite of a lesson learned. Sunlight blazed off the briefcase he carried, a shimmering symbol of the power he now held, the power he'd been forced to seize.